Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us to talk about the mill assessment study. I'm going to introduce Karen Morrison to introduce the project. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Morrison, and I am the Chief Deputy Director at the Department of Pesticide Regulation. Thank you all so much for joining the webinar today on the draft mill assessment recommendations prepared by Crowe. This is part of a effort that we've been engaged in for the last year plus. As a part of the 2021 budget, DPR received funding to have an external consultant evaluate our department's funding and prepare recommendations for how to sustainably fund our department moving forward. Crowe kicked off this work about a year ago through quite a bit of detailed evaluations on their end, as well as many, many meetings with our internal staff and external partners. And I want to thank all of you who have participated in small group discussions, listening sessions, public comment periods, previous webinars to provide input on this project. It's been really valuable, and we're so appreciative for the time, energy, and engagement spent on that, and also to Crowe for all of their work. And so with that, I'm going to hand things over to Wendy and her team to talk through this milestone of the draft recommendations and to give an overview of where we're at. Next steps are going to be more Q&A, more feedback as we head toward final recommendations later this year. So hand it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Karen. And I will echo our appreciation of all of you and other stakeholders who participated. We learned a lot through our communications with you all, and really could not have done this without your help and your input. I'm going to provide a quick introduction of our team, and then we will get into the presentation. So Crowe is a national consulting and accounting firm. We have a large presence in Sacramento. All of our team here is based in Sacramento, and we've been supporting state of California agencies and departments for 30-ish years, doing cost studies, assessments, fee studies, program evaluations, IT implementation support, stakeholder engagement, and change management. So really have appreciated the opportunity to work on this study. My name is Wendy Pratt. I'm a managing director with Crowe, and am serving as a project advisor. Tommy Abeda is the project manager on this and is a senior manager on our Sacramento team. We have Jason Chan, manager on the Sacramento team, has been an analyst deep into the numbers, and Jamie Hammond, a senior staff, also an analyst that's worked on this project throughout. We also have two subcontractors, Melanie Okoro from Eco Alpha and Rick Halprin from GC Green, and they contributed throughout to this project. Next slide. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about this afternoon, just reintroduce the study objectives and milestones and proposal recommendations. So we'll look at some of the options that we proposed in the recommendation study. And then thinking back to the concept paper that we released in January, we outlined 3 areas or considerations for the mill: design recommendations, usage recommendations, and implementation recommendations. So we'll walk through those and then talk about next steps. So just a couple housekeeping items. The Q&A and chat features are disabled. If you do have questions, please send them to the projectmillstudy@cdpr.ca.gov email. Also, we'll talk about at the end, there's numerous more opportunities for engagement as we kind of wind down this study, and this is being recorded. So the mill study objectives were laid out for us when we started this study back in early 2022. I won't read through them all now, but looking at these, the first 3 are really focused on current and future funding and revenue and the structure and rate of the mill. And then the second 3 take more of a policy lens and looking at incentivizing safer, sustainable pest management and looking at long-term sustainability of DPR's funding. Sort of a broad look at the study objectives. So mill assessment study and milestones. So these sort of large boxes lay out really the process that we've been working through over the last year plus. Really, we began with extensive research and initial interviews with both DPR staff and with program stakeholders to kind of get an understanding of the lay of the land and some of the challenges and issues. In the summer and into the fall, we conducted extensive stakeholder engagement, kind of one-on-one sessions with 40 or so stakeholder groups, and then took all the information that we've developed through our analysis, through our research, through our stakeholder conversations, which really informed the alternatives that we identified in the concept paper, which was released in early December. We held some additional sort of listening and Q&A sessions in the winter, and in parallel conducted a detailed workload analysis, and that report was released, I believe, in the end of February. So looking at DPR staff activities and needs and gaps. So all of this information, which relied heavily on the input we received from you throughout, and stakeholders and our research analysis, has led to the development of these preliminary recommendations that are in the report and that we'll run through this afternoon. So there will be another round of Q&A and listening sessions and a comment period, and then we will be putting together final recommendations for DPR in the middle to end of June. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tommy Abeda to talk about the proposal options.
Thanks, Wendy. So based upon all of the milestones that Wendy had just described, within our recommendations, preliminary recommendations report, we identify some options that really sustainably and appropriately meet the department's needs, CAC's needs, CDFA's needs, and SPM programmatic needs. Within the report, we spell out specifically the minimum revenue requirements associated to meet the needs that we identify within the report. And then we also identified the estimated incremental rate requirements to generate the associated revenue. One thing to note, the revenue and the associated minimum revenue requirements reflect fiscal year 21-22 estimated pesticide sales, which total roughly $4.4 billion. And really, these options are not ordered in a manner to be prioritized. They reflect just various options for consideration as we move forward and to finalize our recommendations. Later on in the presentation, we'll give a little bit more to describe these options and how they were essentially reflected within our mill usage recommendation. So I'll kind of dive a little bit more into key descriptions of these core options later on in the presentation. So one of the two things that we looked at in defining and identifying those options was first to look at the sustainability of mill revenue to support both the department, CAC, CDFA, and SPM programmatic needs into the future. So we looked at both current revenue generated by the existing mill rate, but then we also looked at a number of factors that may impact future mill revenue into the future. We do spell out a lot of this information within the report, so I highly encourage you all to take some time to read through that. But generally, our analysis shows that mill revenue is likely a sustainable funding source to support the recommended mill proposal options that we've identified for at least up to the next 10 years, given both our assessment of historical, current, and future factors that may impact mill revenue based upon current and future pesticide sales. We do provide, for illustration purposes, just a buildup of those incremental rates that we've identified that would be needed to support those options within this graphic, just for illustrative purposes to show what the incremental buildup would look like at both kind of the different sides of two scenarios. One meaning sales decreased by 5% and sales increased by 5%. Another caveat, just to take away for some context, really over the course of the last several fiscal years, specifically from fiscal year 2014 to 2015 through fiscal year 21-22, pesticide sales on average have increased 3% each year, with one exception in fiscal year 2021 when pesticide sales increased at roughly 12% due to pandemic pressures and implications. So generally, we take away that pesticide sales have generally increased at the same rate as inflation in normal inflationary years. So based on historical trends, as I mentioned, just to take away, just as a key takeaway from this slide, we really would anticipate a worst case scenario would be that sales decrease up to 5% from fiscal year 21-22 levels, especially considering as the market stabilizes after post-pandemic pressures. So in addition to looking at the sustainability of the mill, we also looked at the appropriateness of the mill to support the varying options that we've outlined within our preliminary recommendations. I encourage you all to take a look at the workload study that is on the Mill Assessment Study webpage, because we do provide a lot of context, including the legal and other authorities that support the rationale for the mill to support DPR, including other regulatory fees to support DPR's programmatic needs. We found that roughly mill revenue appropriately supports roughly 65% of the department's programmatic needs for its authorized functions. We also found that the department's current and future mill-related programmatic needs should be supported by mill revenues, given that the programs that are supported by the mill really address some of the core authorized functions that the department performs that are not registration or licensing related. So we did do an in-depth analysis of that through our workload study and continued through our preliminary development of our recommendations. So I really encourage you all to take some time to read through some of the findings of that report that would support this information. Last but not least, we did look at some of the research and information and perspectives on the general fund, and using the general fund to potentially support some of DPR's core functions. And really, we found that using the general fund to support the recommended proposal options, there's really a number of factors that may negatively impact both the stability and the effectiveness, including long-term success of the programs if those programs or programmatic needs were to be supported by the general fund. This question on the general fund came up 20 years ago when the last time the department had embarked on a similar study. And at that time, LAO, actually previous to that, LAO had looked into that as well. We do spell out LAO's core arguments on why it is reasonable and appropriate for the department to be supported, specifically the department's mill programmatic needs to be supported by the mill through regulatory fees. And we spell that out in the report. So again, my key message probably is to read the details, and we'll be more than happy to kind of walk through some of the questions you may have through subsequent conversations and listening sessions if you would like to hear more from us on some of the rationale, both on the sustainability of the mill revenues, but also the appropriateness of the mill to support the options that we've identified. With that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Wendy, who's going to dive into our design recommendations.
Thank you, Tommy. So kind of linking back to the concept paper, as you remember, we had the design, implementation, and usage recommendations, and we identified a number of sort of the kind of details of how to implement the mill. So not just looking at the amounts of the mill, the levels, but some of the structure, and the functions and the implementation, timing, et cetera. So we're going to walk through the recommendations that we identified, sort of building on what was in the concept paper, but then looking at and leveraging our analysis and kind of where we landed with our recommendations on these different topics. So the first one is a legislative authority of the mill, and the question was, should the mill be set in statute or authorized in statute and set in regulation? And our recommendation is that the mill, a maximum rate and structure for the mill should be set in statute. We think the maximum rate should be a little bit higher than what rate is identified through the next processes of finalizing the study, to allow for some flexibility to increase it in future years. And then that the director should have authority to increase the mill up to that maximum through the regulatory process. And this recommendation is in line with the current approach of how the mill is structured in legislation. Also, pretty unanimous input from stakeholders that they preferred sort of the accountability that would exist with the legislative authority over the mill. And then providing this higher maximum rate does give some flexibility to take into account changes that may occur in the next several years. The second area is alignment, and I think Tommy really touched on this in his last couple of slides. Is the mill aligned with statutory mandates, regulations, program expenditures, and incentivizing sustainable pest management? And I think it's important that the mill be aligned, and that's sort of part of one of the objectives of the study. And in our sort of deep dive into the workload and evaluation of recommendations, we believe that the mill is for those mill-related activities. There are specific registration activities that should be supported through registration fees, and similarly licensing and certification has its own fee structure. But that 65% of DPR's activities are appropriately aligned to the mill. And then the third area related to setting the mill was revenue stability. And is the mill set to provide a stable revenue source? And the graph that Tommy showed earlier sort of confirms that for at least the near sort of 5 to 10 years, we believe that the current mill structure will be a stable revenue source. Just based on sort of the historical trends and expectations going forward. The next slide looks at the structure of the mill and sort of that big question that one of our initial tasks in objectives of the study at the start was, should the mill be a flat rate or a tiered rate? So our recommendation is in the near term initially to set the mill at a flat rate. And then potentially when priority pesticides are identified through the process outlined in the SPM roadmap, that would be a point where the list of priority pesticides could be utilized for tiering, to revisit that as an option at that point once those priority pesticides have been identified. That having that higher mill on priority pesticides would serve to educate users and manufacturers, and sort of a policy signal and potentially a funding signal on the use of safer, sustainable pest management practices. So that's something that could be built into the mill going forward. Another area related to structure was reserve mechanism. And would there be a need for a specific mechanism, perhaps a one mill that would be set aside to build a reserve? And we do not recommend incorporating that self-correcting funding mechanism into the mill. There were a lot of concerns raised by stakeholders regarding that. I think also we have other mechanisms in the mill structure, that regular reviews and an additional cushion in the maximum legislative authority that could be used to address the need for a reserve if the fund revenue and expenditures became out of balance. I am going to now turn it over to Tommy to talk about programmatic funding.
Thanks, Wendy. So over the course of the next couple of slides, back to my earlier comment about describing a little bit more in detail some of the options that we laid out at the beginning of the presentation. Really, those options are really describe how mill revenue could be used to support both the department's programmatic needs, CAC's programmatic needs, CDFA's programmatic needs, and then lastly, SPM programmatic needs. So some core questions we asked in the concept paper. The first was, what portion of DPR's future programmatic needs are funded by the mill? And so really through our workload analysis and our continued study throughout this process, we were able to identify an approximate number, roughly $125.3 million is really needed to support DPR's overall programmatic needs. To drill down a little bit more, roughly this equates to $102.1 million based on the department's fiscal year 22-23 budget. And then it also includes future programmatic needs of roughly $23.2 million. We do identify the DPR's mill-related responsibilities within Section 2 of Exhibit 15, and that is in alignment with that pie chart that I walked through earlier. But that really kind of illustrates what is currently being supported by the mill from a function standpoint, so you can kind of understand, you know, what is mill related versus registration and licensing related. At the CAC level, you know, a core question that we looked into is at what level does the mill support CACs? And so as part of addressing this question, you know, we really listened to not only stakeholders, but we engaged CACs and CACASA to really understand some of their perspectives on this question. And so our core recommendation on this is to maintain the existing mill allotment criteria in up to roughly $10.2 million funded by the mill assessment that provides as needed funding, which would be separate from the existing mill allotment criteria to support CAC's pesticide use enforcement programs and administration priorities. As far as CDFA, again, similarly, we did listen to stakeholders and we did work with CDFA to identify their future programmatic needs. Our recommendation to address this question is really to maintain the existing mill assessment level while an additional incremental amount that would be applied to ag products to support the needs of their program, which would essentially equate to roughly $2.9 million. Lastly, as part of our concept paper, we had asked stakeholders and others some questions around funding for positive incentives. And just to clarify, what we mean by funding for positive incentives, this would be funding mechanisms to really support and incentivize safer, sustainable pest management, but also support for research, education, or grants or other mechanisms to really inform and support new pest management approaches. And so really our recommendation at this point is to lay out an option, which we do in the report in our preliminary recommendations, to utilize the mill assessment to support actions that are aligned with the SPM roadmap. And at the rate that we provide in the report, roughly 2.5 mils, this would generate roughly $11 million per year, which would support activities aligned with the roadmap. I'm going to pass it over to Wendy, who is going to discuss implementation.
Thanks, Tommy. So this slide walks through some of the, I think, sort of nuts and bolts of mill implementation and kind of associated with timing and some of these other evaluation factors. So the first question here was, should the mill be implemented at once or over a phased-in process? And our recommendation is to implement an updated mill assessment over a phased-in rate, so over 3 years or 5 years, sort of to be determined. And one reason for that is much of the sort of additional spending required to meet some of the current and future programmatic needs involve hiring new staff, and that is a process that takes some time. So I think it makes sense to sort of build into the higher revenue needs over time. So another question is, when should the new mill recommendation begin? And our recommendation at this point is to start the new mill process in fiscal year 2024-25, so essentially just over a year from now. So giving some time to go through the budget and legislative processes. So related to mill adjustments, so is there a built-in structure to adjust the mill in the future? As kind of we all know, the mill has been at the same current level for 20 or so years, and that's really not sort of good fee practice in terms of best practices for setting and evaluating regulatory fees. So what we recommend is an examination of the mill assessment every 5 years at a minimum to review and potentially adjust what the level is necessary to fund the program and for revenue stabilization. And that's especially going to be important as the SPM roadmap related priorities are sort of determined in the coming years and rolled out for those parts of those priorities that are associated with DPR. A related question is, what's the process to review and monitor the mill over time? And existing and also good practice is for the department to analyze its financial conditions during the annual budgeting process, and then determine whether an adjustment to the mill would be necessary. So again, that would be up to that maximum amount that would be set in statute. That could be done on an annual process. And the final item on this slide is stakeholder involvement, and that we believe it's very important that stakeholders, be consulted and engaged during these review processes and any adjustment processes related to updates to the mill. The next slide and sort of last slide related to the mill recommendations is the mill contribution to the department's funding mix. And if you think back to the slide Tommy showed with the blue, green, and yellow funding mix, the mill provides supports about 65% of DPR's funding mix, and then with registration and licensing covering the others. And we found that is an appropriate, the mill is an appropriate funding source to support those proposal options outlined at the beginning, and those activities sort of in blue shown in that pie chart. Again, a lot of detail on this in both the recommendation study and in the workload analysis. And then also, as Tommy mentioned, we did look pretty carefully at the issue of general fund. That's something many stakeholders mentioned as a potential funding source for DPR, but that we found that that's not a sustainable nor appropriate funding source to support DPR's mill-related activities. The last item is mill revenue levels and other DPR funding sources. So how do changes to mill revenue levels impact other current and potential DPR funding sources? So we found that additional mill assessment revenues to support the recommended proposal options would only support those DPR authorized responsibilities, excluding registration and licensing and certification related responsibilities, that those are really separate buckets and activities, if you will, and each are linked and should be linked to their appropriate funding source. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tommy to kind of talk about next steps.
Thanks, Wendy. On this slide, we provide an overview of the proposed implementation plan that is outlined within the preliminary recommendations and implementation plan report. Really, there's 3 key phases. The first is pre-implementation. Following that would be implementation, and then also post-implementation. One thing to point out is that throughout these processes or phases, there would be ongoing engagement to really provide and obtain input from stakeholders throughout these processes. The first would be in the winter of this year through spring. The first step would be to develop the BCP based upon the final report and additional engagement with stakeholders. The second would be in the winter of next year. You would then also expect the release of the governor's fiscal year 24-25 budget, which would potentially include the BCP, outcomes of the BCP. As far as implementation, the department in the spring would begin its recruitment strategy, which would likely be phased, given that the department will not necessarily need the full amounts that we showed on the incremental rate slide. And then in summer, potentially you would expect implementation of the mill proposal on July 1st of 2024. As far as post-implementation, really kind of thinking about the implementation considerations and recommendations that we laid out, really thinking about 3 to 5 years after implementation, kind of 3 key activities. The first would be phasing in the mill adjustments, again, looking at those incremental rates and phasing them in over 3 to 5 years to support new resources to fulfill the various programmatic needs. Also, considering the mill review process and what that looks like in order to continue to appropriately and sustainably support the programs. And then last but not least, as mentioned, consider tiered mill for priority pesticides once they are defined. And so really in a nutshell, the proposed implementation plan provides some guidance and potential next steps as after the mill recommendations are finalized in June. One thing to note, just want to recognize that we have been receiving some questions in the chat throughout this webinar. So we really encourage you all to take some time to send some of those questions in writing to the project email. And please feel free to take some time to get back to us, but really we're encouraging all to respond by the end of May. Additionally, as mentioned, we will be conducting additional listening sessions and to have some sessions to address some of the questions that you might have on some of the information that we just covered today and some of the details within the report. So please feel free to sign up for any one of the 3 Q&A sessions. We're really expecting a lot of interest, so please feel free to send Jamie Hammond an email. We provide her email address on this slide, your 2 preferred dates, and we will send out an invite in order to schedule a meeting with you all that meets the day that you request. With that being said, I think that concludes our webinar for today. And again, just want to echo Karen and Wendy. We thank everybody's time throughout the study, and it's been really great hearing everyone's perspectives on this, and it's been really helpful for the Crowe team to listen to you all and help us as far as developing our recommendations and also outlining implementation. That being said, thank you all. We really appreciate you attending today's session. Thank you.